Tonight, these two are heading to the other world, Greg said, his grin wide with malice as he stroked his mother's hand. My stomach churned, but I kept my face emotionless. My name is Sarah Harris, and this is the story of how I narrowly escaped a fate worse than death at the hands of the man I once loved. It all started when my friend Julia set me up with Greg, worried that at 35 I was still single. Greg was charming, successful, and seemingly hard-working, running his family's construction firm. Our whirlwind romance saw us married within 6 months, both of us eager to start a family. When our son Ethan was born, everything seemed perfect. But gradually, Greg's true colors began to show. He would come home late, sometimes not at all, claiming the stress of managing the debt-ridden company was overwhelming him. His rare appearances were marked by derogatory remarks, insisting that as a stay-at-home mom, I contributed nothing to the household. Despite my growing suspicions, I never imagined the depths of Greg's depravity until that fateful night when I overheard his conversation with his mother, Marcia. Their sinister plot to drug Ethan and me during our upcoming anniversary dinner and bury us alive at one of the construction sites chilled me to the bone. In that moment, I knew I had to act. I contacted a lawyer and the police, determined to bring this nightmare to an end. We devised a plan to catch Greg and Marcia red-handed, and as much as it pained me, I had to pretend everything was normal. The night of our anniversary celebration arrived, and Ethan and I played our parts perfectly. We feigned drinking the spiked beverages, collapsing as the drugs took effect. Greg's callousness as he loaded our unconscious bodies into his truck was sickening, but I held strong, waiting for the perfect moment. As he began burying us alive, my heart raced, but I knew the police were closing in. Just as Greg finished covering the graves, they swooped in, having tracked the truck's GPS. The look on his face as I sprang up, revealing the damning evidence I had recorded, will be forever etched in my memory. Greg and Marcia's arrest was a relief, but the true victory came in the courtroom, where they faced the consequences of their heinous actions. With their lengthy sentences and the implosion of the family business, justice was finally served. After the harrowing ordeal, I thought the nightmare was finally over. But Greg's true colors only became more apparent in the aftermath. "You're lucky I don't sue you for defamation," he spat during one of our mandated meetings to discuss the divorce proceedings, putting me through that humiliating charade just because you got jealous and paranoid. His words stung, but I refused to show any reaction. Deep down, I knew the truth. The recorded evidence of his despicable plot was undeniable. "I want full custody of Ethan," I stated firmly, "and a fair share of the assets from your family's business," Greg scoffed. "You think you deserve a penny after what you pulled? You'll be lucky if I don't take Ethan away from you entirely." His threats only strengthened my resolve. I would not let this man continue to manipulate and control me or jeopardize my son's well-being. Fortunately, my lawyer David was a formidable ally. "Your client's actions speak for themselves," he countered. "Mrs. Harris has more than enough grounds for full custody and a substantial settlement, unless you'd like this to go to trial." The thought of his misdeeds being publicly exposed seemed to give Greg pause. After some tense back and forth, we reached an agreement. I would get primary custody of Ethan, along with a sizable alimony payment from the liquidated assets of Greg's construction firm. As we finalized the paperwork, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction watching Greg's signature on the dotted line. His once charming facade had crumbled, revealing the true monster beneath. "This isn't over," he muttered darkly as he stormed out of the office. But for me, it was a new beginning. With the divorce finalized and Greg out of our lives for good, Ethan and I could finally start healing. The first few months were understandably difficult. Ethan had witnessed things no child should ever have to see, and there were nights when he would wake up screaming from nightmares. But we stuck together, sought counseling, and slowly but surely, the light began to return to his eyes. For my part, I made the decision to return to my previous career in marketing, a path I had set aside when Ethan was born. Juggling work and single parenthood was a challenge, but I found strength in knowing that I was doing it all for my son's sake. There were moments when I still struggled with the trauma of what Greg had put us through. The betrayal by someone I had loved and trusted so deeply, left scars that may never fully heal. But I refused to let it define me or hold me back from giving Ethan the life he deserved. As the years passed, we grew stronger, closer, and more resilient. Greg's wrath had nearly torn us apart, but in the end it only served to forge an unbreakable bond between a mother and her son. Despite the relief of finalizing the divorce and securing Ethan's safety, the wounds from Greg's betrayal ran deep. For months after, I would find myself repeatedly going over our credit card statements, analyzing every single charge with a scrutinizing eye. It was during one of those late nights, poring over the records, that a particular transaction made my blood run cold. An extravagant dinner for two at an upscale restaurant, followed by purchases at a high-end jewelry store. The dates matched up with one of the many nights Greg had claimed to be working late at the office. My mind raced with a sickening realization. This was far from the first time Greg had been unfaithful. As I dug deeper into the statements from previous years, more and more unexplained charges began to surface. Fancy hotels, lavish gifts, all paid for with money that should have gone towards supporting our family. The evidence was insurmountable. Greg's lies and infidelity had been going on for years, possibly even before Ethan was born. I felt sick to my stomach, waves of anger and humiliation crashing over me as I confronted the full extent of his deceit. In that moment, I wanted nothing more than to confront him, to scream in rage until he understood the pain he had inflicted on me and our son. But I knew it would be futile. Greg was a master of manipulation, and any attempt at confrontation would only give him the opportunity to twist the narrative and make me the villain once again. Instead, I channeled my anger into determination. I would not let this break me. For Ethan's sake, I had to be strong. As the months passed, I focused all my energy on rebuilding our lives and creating a stable, loving home for my son. Whenever the pain and resentment threatened to overwhelm me, I would look at Ethan's smiling face and remind myself that he was all that mattered. It wasn't easy, especially as Ethan grew older and began to ask more questions about his father. "Why doesn't Dad ever come to see me?" he would ask, his eyes filled with confusion and hurt. In those moments, I had to bite my tongue to keep from unleashing the full truth about Greg's despicable actions. As much as I wanted to shield Ethan from the harsh realities of his father's cruelty, I knew that one day he would need to know the truth. But for now, I focused on providing him with the love and stability that Greg had failed to offer. We created new traditions, just the two of us, weekend trips to the park, movie nights with his favorite snacks, and bedtime stories that always ended with a reminder of how much I loved him. Slowly but surely, the dark cloud of Greg's betrayal began to lift. With each passing year, the pain became a little more manageable, the anger a little less consuming. And through it all, Ethan remained my unwavering source of strength and resilience. No matter what challenges life threw our way, we faced them together, a mother and son bound by an unbreakable bond forged in the fires of adversity. It was a warm summer evening, and Ethan was outside playing catch with one of the neighbors while I prepared dinner. The radio was on, filling the kitchen with a cheerful tune as I hummed along, finally feeling a sense of peace after years of turmoil. That's when I heard it, Greg's voice, clear as day, coming from the other room. At first I froze, my heart pounding as irrational fear gripped me. But then I realized it wasn't Greg himself, but rather a phone conversation he was having with his mother, Marcia. Curiosity got the better of me, and I crept towards the living room, straining to make out their words. "Can't believe she actually thought she could take everything from me," Greg was saying, his voice laced with venom. "After all I've done for her and the brat." My blood boiled at his callous reference to Ethan, but I forced myself to stay silent, listening intently. "Don't worry, son," Marcia's voice crackled through the speaker. "We'll make sure they get what's coming to them." A chill ran down my spine as Greg let out a dark chuckle. "Oh, they will. I've got it all planned out. A nice little anniversary dinner for the three of us. A special drink to help them relax." Realization hit me like a ton of bricks as the pieces fell into place. The twisted smiles, the chilling words, they were plotting to drug Ethan and me, to do God knows what. Tears stung my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Not this time. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking as I hit the record button, capturing every vile detail of their sinister plan. Once they're out, we'll load them up and take a little trip out to the old brickyard construction site, Greg continued, his voice dripping with malice. Bury them deep in the foundations. No one will ever find them. I clapped a hand over my mouth to stifle the sob that threatened to escape. This was no empty threat. I knew Greg well enough to recognize the cold, calculated determination in his tone. But even as fear gripped my heart, a newfound resolve took hold. I would not let this monster hurt my son. Not again. The conversation went on, each twisted detail more horrifying than the last, but I forced myself to listen, to gather every shred of evidence I could. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the call ended. I stood there shaking, clutching the phone like a lifeline. Then, without a moment's hesitation, I dialed the number I had committed to memory. Detective Carter, the woman who had helped me bring Greg's initial plot to light. Within hours, a plan was set in motion. We would play along, feigning ignorance of Greg's twisted scheme. And when the moment came, we would be ready, to expose his depravity once and for all, and ensure that this time there would be no escape. The next few days were a blur of planning and preparation. Detective Carter and her team worked tirelessly, coordinating every detail to ensure our safety, while simultaneously gathering enough evidence to put Greg and Marcia away for good. We'll have officers stationed nearby, but out of sight, Carter explained as we went over the plan one final time. The moment you give the signal, we'll move in. I nodded, my heart pounding at the thought of finally putting an end to this nightmare. But more than anything, I was focused on keeping Ethan calm and protected. When the time came to break the news to him, I struggled to find the right words. How could I explain the depths of his father's depravity without shattering his innocence? In the end, I settled for a simplified version of the truth. Daddy has done some very bad things, I told him, my voice trembling slightly. But we're going to make sure he can't hurt us anymore. Ethan's eyes widened, a flicker of fear crossing his face. But to his credit, he nodded bravely. I trust you, Mom. Those 4 simple words nearly brought me to tears. After everything we'd been through, my son still looked at me with unwavering faith and love. It was that bond that gave me the strength to see this through. The days leading up to the anniversary dinner were tense, but we carried on as normal, feigning ignorance of Greg's twisted plot. Whenever he called to discuss the plans, I forced a cheerful tone, playing the part of the oblivious wife. I can't wait to celebrate with you and Ethan, I lied through gritted teeth. It's going to be such a special night. Greg's smug chuckle made my skin crawl. Oh, it'll be a night you'll never forget, all right? Finally, the dreaded evening arrived. As Ethan and I dressed for the occasion, I could see the fear in his eyes, no matter how hard he tried to hide it. It's going to be okay, I whispered, pulling him into a tight embrace. I won't let anything happen to you, I promise. He clung to me, his small body trembling slightly. In that moment, I silently vowed that no matter what it took, I would protect him from the monster that dared call himself his father. The drive to the restaurant was tense, Greg's malicious grin growing wider with every mile. But I refused to show any outward sign of distress, focusing instead on the plan, and the knowledge that justice was finally within reach. As we were seated at our table, Greg leaned in close, his breath hot against my ear. Enjoy your drinks, he hissed. They've got a special kick to them. I swallowed hard, forcing a smile as I nodded in feigned eagerness. Across the table, Ethan's eyes met mine, and we shared a silent understanding. It was time. My heart pounded in my chest as I raised the glass to my lips, the liquid sloshing precariously close to the rim. Across the table, Ethan mirrored my movements, his small hands trembling ever so slightly. To family, Greg sneered, his eyes glinting with malice as he clinked his glass against ours. I forced myself to maintain eye contact, refusing to show even a flicker of the fear and disgust that threatened to consume me. We had one chance to pull this off, and I couldn't afford any missteps. Slowly, deliberately, I tipped the glass back and let the spiked liquid pour down my throat. The bitter taste nearly made me gag, but I swallowed it down, fighting the urge to cough or sputter. Ethan followed suit, his face contorting slightly as the drug hit his system. For a heart-stopping moment, I feared he might break character, But he held strong, my brave, resilient boy. "Doesn't that feel nice and relaxing?" Greg crooned, his voice dripping with sadistic glee as he watched us slump in our chairs, feigning the effects of the potent sedative. I forced my eyelids to droop, my head lolling to the side as if I had lost consciousness. Every instinct screamed at me to stay alert, to fight back against this monster who dared call himself my husband. But I knew I had to play along, at least for now. The sound of Greg's chair scraping against the floor sent a jolt through me, but I remained perfectly still, my breathing shallow and even. "You two really are pathetic," he sneered, his voice growing fainter as he moved towards the exit. "But don't worry, I'll make sure you're taken care of, permanently." A twisted chuckle, and then the sound of the restaurant door swinging shut behind him. Only then did I dare to crack an eye open, scanning the room for any sign of the waitstaff or other patrons. But it was empty, just as Carter had promised. The entire place had been cleared out, save for the undercover officers posing as staff members. My gaze flickered to Ethan, and my heart swelled with a mix of pride and sorrow. No child should ever have to endure such a horrifying ordeal, and yet there he sat, slumped in his chair but alive and unharmed. I wanted nothing more than to pull him into my arms and reassure him that the nightmare was almost over. But I knew we couldn't risk breaking cover. Not yet. The minutes ticked by in agonizing silence, the only sound the muffled clink of dishes being cleared away by the staff. I strained my ears, waiting for the telltale sign that Greg had returned, ready to transport us to our would-be graves. And then, finally, it came. The familiar rumble of his truck's engine, growing louder as it pulled up to the entrance. "Showtime!" A gruff voice murmured in my ear, and I felt a reassuring hand on my shoulder. Carter and her team were in position, ready to strike. The sound of footsteps, heavy and purposeful, and then Greg's hulking form appeared in the doorway. He paused for a moment, surveying the scene with a twisted grin. "Like two little lambs to the slaughter," he sneered, moving towards Ethan's limp form. That was my cue. In one fluid motion, I shot upright in my chair, my eyes flying open as I fixed Greg with a steely glare. "That's enough," I growled, my voice trembling with barely contained fury. "It's over, Greg. We've got you." For a split second, his cocky facade faltered, his eyes widening in shock and disbelief. But it was too late. Carter and her team were already swarming in, their guns trained squarely on him. As the cuffs clicked around his wrists, I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. The monster had been caged at last, and this time there would be no escape. The look on Greg's face as the cuffs clicked into place was one I would never forget. A potent mix of shock, rage, and utter disbelief. For a moment, he simply stood there, gaping at me like a landed fish. You recorded me?" he finally sputtered, his eyes bulging with fury. "How dare you?" I met his gaze unflinchingly, emboldened by the knowledge that his reign of terror was finally at an end. "I did what I had to do to protect my son," I stated, my voice ringing with conviction. "From you." A muscle twitched in Greg's jaw, and for a split second, I thought he might try to lunge at me, but the firm grip of the officers on either side of him held him in place. "You'll pay for this," he spat, his words laced with venom. "You and that little brat. I'll make sure you both rot in hell." A chill ran down my spine at the pure malice in his tone, but I refused to let him see my fear. "Not anymore." "Save it for the judge," Carter interjected coolly, giving Greg a hard shove towards the exit. "You've got a lot of explaining to do." As they led him away, his curses and threats echoing down the hallway, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, a burden I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying for so long. It was over. We were safe. I turned to Ethan, who had remained silent throughout the entire confrontation, his eyes wide and fixed on the spot where his father had stood moments before. "Ethan?" I said softly, crouching down to meet his gaze. "It's okay now. He can't hurt us anymore." For a long moment, he simply stared at me, his expression unreadable. Then, without warning, he threw his arms around me, clinging to me with a desperation that made my heart ache. "I was so scared, Mommy," he whispered, his small body trembling against mine. "I thought he was going to." His voice trailed off, but I knew what he meant. The thought of Greg's twisted plans of what might have happened if we hadn't been able to stop him made me feel sick to my stomach. "Shh, it's all right," I murmured, stroking his hair as I fought back my own tears. You were so brave, sweetheart. So brave. We stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, mother and son united in our relief and our shared trauma. It would take time, I knew, for the wounds to fully heal. But in that moment, we had each other, and that was enough. As the dust settled and the adrenaline faded, the true weight of what we had accomplished began to sink in. Not only had we escaped Greg's clutches, but we had also secured the evidence needed to ensure he and his equally twisted mother would face the full consequences of their actions. The trial was, in many ways, even more harrowing than the initial ordeal. Listening to the sordid details of their plans, the casual disregard for human life, it was almost more than I could bear. But I forced myself to remain strong, if not for my own sake, then for Ethan's. And when the guilty verdicts were finally read, sentencing Greg and Marcia to lengthy prison terms, I felt a sense of vindication unlike any I'd ever experienced. Justice, at long last, had been served. In the aftermath, as we began to pick up the pieces and rebuild our lives, I found solace in the knowledge that we had persevered against the darkness. Greg's wrath had nearly consumed us, but in the end, it was our love and resilience that had prevailed. It would be a long road, I knew, but we would walk it together, a mother and son, forged in the fires of adversity, stronger and more unbreakable than ever before. With Greg and Marcia behind bars, Ethan and I could finally begin to rebuild our lives without the specter of their malice looming over us. Of course, the road ahead was far from easy. The scars of their betrayal ran deep, and there were times when the trauma threatened to overwhelm us both. But we faced those challenges head-on, seeking counseling and leaning on each other for strength and support. Slowly but surely, the nightmares that had plagued Ethan's sleep began to subside, and the light returned to his eyes. For my part, I made the decision to reclaim my career, dusting off my marketing degree and re-entering the workforce. Juggling work and single parenthood was a constant balancing act. But I found solace in the routine, in the knowledge that I was providing for my son and paving the way for a brighter future. Of course, there were moments when the weight of it all felt crushing. Times when I would catch a glimpse of a father and son walking hand in hand, and the ache of what Greg had robbed us of would hit me like a physical blow. But I refused to let those moments define us. Instead, I channeled that pain into creating new traditions and cherished memories, just the two of us. Weekend trips to the park, movie nights with Ethan's favorite snacks, and bedtime stories that always ended with a reminder of how much I loved him. These small moments became the building blocks of our new lives. And through it all, the bond between us only grew stronger. We were survivors, warriors who had faced the darkest depths of human cruelty and emerged victorious. That shared experience forged a connection deeper than any I could have ever imagined, an unbreakable tether that no force on earth could sever. As the years passed and Ethan grew into a remarkable young man, I couldn't help but swell with pride at the person he was becoming. Kind, resilient, and possessed of a strength of character far beyond his years. And yet, there were times when I could still see the shadows of Greg's actions lingering in his eyes, a lingering ache that no amount of love or reassurance could fully erase. It was during those moments that I found myself grateful for the harsh sentences handed down to Greg and Marcia. Their selfish, depraved actions had nearly torn our family apart, and they deserved every second of their lengthy prison terms. And as for the family business they had once prized above all else, well, let's just say that without their guiding hands, it wasn't long before the whole empire came crumbling down around them. The construction firm that had once been their pride and joy was liquidated, its assets seized to help fund the legal fees and settlement I had been awarded. It was a fitting end, in many ways, a tangible representation of how their greed and depravity had ultimately led to their downfall. And as I watched the wrecking balls tear into the foundations of their once mighty empire, I couldn't help but feel a sense of cathartic release. They had tried to bury us, to snuff out our lives in pursuit of their own twisted desires. But in the end, it was their legacy that lay in ruins, while Ethan and I stood tall, stronger and more resilient than ever before. Our path forward was far from easy, but we walked it together, hand in hand, a mother and son united by an unbreakable bond, forged in the fires of adversity. And with each step, the shadows of Greg's wrath grew a little fainter, until they were nothing more than distant echoes of a nightmare we had survived. Our future was ours to shape, unburdened by the weight of his malice, or the specter of his cruelty. And as I looked into Ethan's eyes, brimming with hope and determination, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. Victors, not victims, masters of our own destiny. The guardians of wrath had fallen, and in their place rose a new generation, tempered by hardship but fueled by love, resilience, and an unshakable faith in the power of the human spirit to triumph over even the darkest of storms.